to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I'm Megan Figueroa. Carrie, someone called us insufferable twits.
Sure
on,
did.
On the internet. On the internet.
On the interwebs.
Yeah. You know, we don't get a lot of like actual reviews, which if you do like us, you should totally like give us a review, a positive review. Because when we do get reviews, they seem to be calling us names.
I mean, most of them are good, but we do have a few that are bad. And normally, if it's a 1-star review, I add it to our list because I like showing off like who we do not appeal to.
Right.
But unfortunately, this was a 2-star.
Yeah, oddly a 2-star review from a woman, we think.
What looks like a woman anyway. The name makes it look like a woman. Yeah.
Which I was a little bit surprised because I was thinking, well, women can be misogynist too, but I was thinking you would not call 2 male podcast hosts insufferable twits.
Probably not. No.
It's frustrating.
Yeah. It's not nice. Like, you can give a bad review if you don't like something. That's fine. But, like, calling names is not good.
Yeah.
And I also thought the main complaint with that we're not historians was deeply unfair. Especially since, like, it was something we were obviously just like, maybe this is what's going on. Yeah. We did not make the claim that it was.
Right.
So...
Well, yeah, they said that we aren't serious people despite our credentials. I'm like, we're what?
First of all, I've never aimed to be serious.
Yeah, this is
like you were talking to the wrong person if you want to hurt me that way.
Right, exactly, and yeah, I admit it stung a little bit to be called insufferable twits, but not like the actual that like name being called, but because it's so frustrating to be a woman in this arena and to be in our character being attacked. Like it seems like when there's a bad review, it's like there has to be some sort of character assassination. Yeah.
So for me, I don't care. You're gonna call me a bad name. You can call me a bad name. To me, that reflects more on you than it does on me. Yeah. But I was a little hurt that it was like, oh, you're not, you don't know anything about history, which you know what? Fair. I don't.
Yeah, fair. Fair. Me neither.
So that actually did sting a little, but then I thought about it and I'm like, I've never claimed to be a historian. I've never claimed to be an expert in that area. So
right. Yeah. So
water off a duck's back.
Whatever. And I actually had to look the word twit up.
Oh, really?
Never heard it before. Never heard it. Yeah.
How is that possible?
I don't know. I just didn't know what it meant. So it's a new word for me. Thank you to that person for introducing a new word to my vocabulary.
Speaking of, well, actually, I'm not sure if we can say new vocabulary, but speaking of like new areas of language.
Ooh, that's exciting.
Caveat. This is a very early research and I have no idea if it's going to end up being real, but it's kind of cool that it might. So
I love a caveat like that.
Well, so supposedly scientists have discovered a, quote, phonetic alphabet that is used by sperm whales.
Oh, that is really neat.
Yeah. I mean, I always kind of had this, like, suspicion that if any animals were going to be proven to have something that was, like, close to human language, it would be whales.
Yeah, totally. I'm right there with you.
So they used artificial intelligence to spot patterns, and then that was supposedly helped them uncover the building blocks of whale language. They communicate by, a series of rapid clicks. And NPR's Lauren Sommer describes this as a combination of Morse code and popcorn popping.
Oh!
Which is kind of a nice description.
Yeah. I can exactly imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard whale sound. We've all heard, like, the clicking and the popping. And we've also heard, like, whale song. especially in a Star Trek movie.
And I don't understand that reference since I haven't seen any Star Trek in my life.
How could you not have
know.
seen Star Trek 4, the one where they go to San Francisco and rescue a whale to save the future?
Oh, wow, that's the plot.
Basically.
Wow.
Like, sorry, in like the 80s era San Francisco. Yeah, it's a ludicrous plot, but I loved that movie so much when I was a kid.
Wow.
Okay, so this research project is called Project SETI, like CETI, which stands for Cetacean Translation Initiative.
Oh.
And it's also like very similar to the other SETI, which is like looking for aliens out in space.
Oh.
I just love that.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. So they recorded 400 sperm whales in the Eastern Caribbean between 2005 and 2018.
Oh my gosh, good for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they managed to get 60 individuals, or approximately 60 individuals. So not all 400, but still, that's really, really cool. So they have these series of rapid fire clicks, and researchers have called them codas. And they can consist of between 3 and 40 clicks.
Oh, wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's weird, right? And then also, they not just the number, but also the tempo.
Okay, so they're paying attention to the tempo will be different.
Yes. Yeah, so they call this, the speed, or the tempo, rubato. And then sometimes there's an extra click at the end of a coda, which they call ornamentation.
Ornamentation. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, so apparently there's 156 codas, each with its own rubato, ornamentation, tempo, and rhythm. Like, what?
Wow. That's quite the system.
Really, yeah, really. So they think it's something to do with the combination that are making meaning. And they're not really sure if it's like syllables, words, or sentences.
Yeah, I guess that would be the question, wouldn't it be?
It would be, I mean, we haven't figured out anything. Like, without meaning, I don't know how much you can figure out.
Yeah. That is remarkable. That is really neat.
It is really cool.
It's very human and language-like to have a phonetic alphabet.
Well, we don't know if it is a phonetic alphabet, but yes.
If it were, like the phonetic alphabet that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be very human-like, yeah. And so, like, if they have these set of symbols, which seems like they do, and then those symbols are matched to meaning, then we've got something very close to human language. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how they're going to find out if they match to meaning. I don't know if that's possible.
I have no idea.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable that they've come this far. So who knows what they can do.
Yes. Yeah. It would be really awesome if they could get closer to cracking the code or whatever.
It would be
but anyway,
really, really cool.
Yeah. So I was just very excited about that. There's a bunch of articles about it, but I'll post the Smithsonian Magazine's version of it because it's nice.
Very cool. Oh, that is so much more lovely than being called an insufferable twit. Learning about sperm whales.
Yeah.
And their language.
And their potential language. Yeah. Yeah. I'm excited because, like, I still strongly suspect that there is something there, that it's not just like I don't know, what's the word that people use for AI? Hallucination.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, so like AI can often hallucinate things. So this to me though seems like a proper use of AI that may be less prone to such things, but
yeah.
Well, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, maybe one day we'll be speaking to sperm whales.
That would be so cool.
Yeah, it would be so cool.
But anyway, today's episode is very interesting. We talk about gendered systems of language, and yeah, it's really fun.
Yeah, enjoy.
Enjoy. Today we're very excited to have Dr. Chris Eric Knisely, who is an assistant professor of French and intercultural competence in the Department of French and Italian and affiliated faculty in the Second Language Acquisition and Teaching PhD program and the Trans Studies Research Cluster at the University of Arizona. Chris's research focuses on gender justice in language, education, and research. And Eric Louis Russell is a professor in the Department of French and Italian, affiliated in the departments of linguistics and of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of California, Davis. Eric is a critical linguist whose research focuses on gender and masculinities, sexualities, animus, and power. And we have both of them here today to talk about their edited volume called Redoing Linguistic Worlds, Unmaking Gender Binaries, Remaking Gender Pluralities. So welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Wonderful to be here.
We're so happy you're here.
I've been meaning to have Chris on because I wanted to talk about French gender. So this is especially exciting. First question, why did you want to edit this book and why now?
Eric and I started talking about this book. I think we dated it back about a decade now.
Yeah, more or less.
Wow.
When we were at a Lavender Languages conference, one of the last ones that was held in DC, I was just a little grad student. Eric likes to say that he had a lot less gray hair then.
Indeed. I actually did have a lot less gray hair.
A whole trans approach to linguistics was really starting to bubble up. Lau's work was coming through. We were starting to tangle a little bit with what's this relationship between trans thinking about language and queer linguistics. How does all this fit together? And Eric and I are going, everything's happening in English. Great, good. We need work. But we're also going, we both work on French and nothing's here.
It was not just about English, but it was also in English from a very Anglophone perspective. So I think we both got a bit of an idea, that's a nice way of saying it, that we should challenge that. Some of it is challenging the hegemony of English and the Anglophone world in the linguistics communities.
Yes.
And then from there, it was really a conversation about things are happening with language within or on the periphery of the communities that we participate in. How do we start to have this conversation professionally that's already sort of happening in these communities where people are languaging in ways that don't conform to these really rigid, binaristic conceptions of what gender is, what language is, how we do these things?
It was really important. I work in both French and Italian, as well as a couple other Dutch, or Flemish, rather. What I found was really interesting was just, I keep coming back to the question of perspective and how it was just a very Anglophone perspective on what might be happening, what was happening, just even the questions that could be asked about other languacultural communities. And so it was just really fortunate. Chris and I, in some ways, we're very different. In some ways, we're also very, very complementary. And we just sort of fell into this teamwork. We had several hurdles that we had to, not the least of which, of course, is just academia itself, right? But it's actually been really interesting. And to hit on your question of why now, I mean, I think it's even more important now because of other voices, perhaps, that are getting too much, in my opinion, play around the world, but in languacultural communities, and then particularly within academic languacultural communities. I think it's just really important that we were able to create some space for some other voices. We have tremendous contributors too. I mean, we have to shout out to them. We edited this. We have a couple chapters that we wrote together as well as individually, but our contributors really were and are a hugely important part of this.
I think Eric and I talk a lot about wanting to sort of push the conversation forward. And this book really comes at a time where trans approaches to linguistics are starting to go beyond these sort of 3-4 people, right, all talking to each other.
Yeah.
And it's starting to be something that a lot of grad students are interested in and don't have mentors for, because I think you had Kirby Conrad on the podcast at some point. And if I'm not mistaken, it was with y'all that they were talking about how there aren't trans people in secure positions with these areas of expertise to mentor people. And so I think that was another big thing for Eric and I about why now is we need to have this conversation, because otherwise, without any sort of meaningful engagement with how language actually functions, what language actually is, the broader public is having not this conversation, but they think they're having this conversation.
Absolutely.
And we would do well to have this conversation with the broader public and bring what we have to offer as scholars of language to it. And then I get a lot of emails from grad students saying, hey, can you be on my committee? Eric and I are going, we have to think of better mechanisms to try to get this conversation together, to make there be something concrete and tangible that we can say, awesome, you're interested in this? Grab this book, read this work by these people. And you know what? We'll just tease it right on the front end. We're going to do another iteration of this volume, and we're going to do workshops to try to get you involved. So Eric and I are headed to the Lavender Languages Conference this August
in Brighton in the UK.
Nice.
And we'll also do a virtual version, but just trying to say, come be a part of the conversation. We really mean what we say in the conclusion. Question us, question everybody who wrote this volume, question everybody who's thinking about this, and then come tell us all the ways that we're wrong and we're old and we missed the things that you know about and the things that you do in your languaging communities, and how do we make this more expansive, more participatory.
I like what Chris is saying here too, and I like that we've led with we're already thinking of the next step. And it's not necessarily that we're wrong, but no one person, no one community can see everything. There are 8 billion people on the planet, so there are potentially 8 billion different perspectives on this. And I think what Chris was also hitting on this, what we noticed is that a lot of the folks doing this type of work, involved in participating in these linguocultural communities, languaging in these new ways, and confronting also the pushback on this languaging, are folks that are in less secure positions than us. They're younger in their career. They're perhaps in polities and in situations that are less amenable to doing this work. And so we're really making a commitment to building in mentoring to the next stages and building in also bases. We had several contributors that were interested in the first volume. Well, the first and only one that's out. I'm already very optimistically referring to it as the first one, who for a lot of reasons didn't or were not able to complete something to be a part of it. And we'd really like to, now that we've seen sort of how this plays out and how it works, we'd like to step into that as well. And we'd also like to move past. I think it was a really important step that we moved past Anglophone linguocultural spaces, but we're still very much in the global north. We're in languages that are widely studied, that are widely resourced in terms of positions in academia: French, German, Spanish, and Italian. And I'm really excited about the possibilities of moving past these spaces, not because they're unimportant, but because there's so much else going on out there in the past, in the present, in the futurity. And I think that's really important too, that this book opens up a space, but it's not the only opening. It's maybe the first step in opening things and giving voice to other folks out there and other communities.
I think it makes sense to start with languages that people do at least have some familiarity with. Like if I were to throw Squamish at them, what are they going to do with this information?
Can I just say, please throw Squamish at us? Can we already recruit you for participation in the next volume? I'm the practical one that's not afraid to ask those questions.
I can tell you how the gender system works. I mean, there is a gender system. It's marked on the determiners and the demonstratives. They call them masculine and feminine, but really the masculine ones are unmarked. And then the feminine ones are used for human females, animal females. And sometimes, less so in Squamish, but in some related languages, things like canoes.
Interesting. There are all sorts of interesting, we're talking here about, of course, the manifestation of that which people call gender. It's a tricky term in and of itself. Our use of it comes from Latin, which just means type. Gayness just means type. And so there are languages, when I teach this to undergrads, I often say 36. Seems like that's my base number for throwing out a random thing. But there are lots of ways of cutting up experience and putting it into typologies that needn't have anything to do with that which in our society we refer to as gender, the projection of identity that has, for many, many people, is conflated with biological sex or sex characteristics. There are lots of other ways of doing this in many, many languages in the world. And I think that's also one thing that we need to keep in mind. These folks are redoing their linguistic worlds, but also in a way, there's nothing new about this in the history of humanity. And also, if we look just even across humanity at one particular time, say right now in 2024, there's nothing particularly unusual about challenging typing of experience, and particularly the people in experience. Though it is fascinating that canoes would be typed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
sometimes these things are just artifactual.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't dare speculate on that. I work in romance and dramatic.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with the importance of them. It is still complicated.
Can that be my response to every question for the rest of this discussion? Yes. It's complicated. Even as Eric is talking about how we sort of are mapping these social constructs onto the ways that we're doing language and the relationship between this concept of social gender and then these grammatical and lexical and other forms, that's the first thing my brain does. We've made a mess of it. As humans, we've made it wildly messy. And it could be very simply gridded out, right? We do love to do that. That's what our brains do. And we create these categories and we remix these categories. And then we try to decide. Apparently, it's Kirby Conrad shout out day. I love thinking with the way that they talk about what social gender is and how it's these groupings. We sort of riff on that in the book. It's these groupings of roles, practices, and identities into sort of, this is kind of like that. And then they get filtered into these legible categories. And then people position themselves within and against the categories that they're aware. And then they do all of this with language, sometimes with these noun classes or other things that we're calling gender in language, and sometimes in ways that has absolutely nothing to do with that.
What Chris is referring to is, in some ways I talk about this particularly with students who don't have much of a background in linguistics or language study, is we're humans, we put things in boxes. This is what we do. But we tend to take it for granted that those boxes are our creation. Maybe not individual creation, they're sort of our collective creation, they're our inheritance because the creation is foisted upon us. But it may be inevitable that we put things in boxes, but the boxes themselves and the distribution of those boxes and the importance of those boxes is entirely encultured. And it's something that we're constantly doing. This is a point that Chris and I really felt like we had to make early on in the book and break down some ways that people talk about language. It's become a bit of like cavallo di battaglia for me, like this sort of, I don't know what that is in English, sort of like my theme thing that I bring up every time I talk about things. Language isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's something we do. It doesn't exist. It's something that predicates and it allows us to be in relation, to commune with others, right? To be in common with others. But we act as if it were. And we do this all the time, day in and day out. And we do that, I think, and it decenters the human. It decenters the people both as agents and as recipients of this action. And it sort of like creates this sort of meta hegemony where it just sort of naturalizes and invisibilizes itself, where we'll see people saying like, well, you just can't do that because French doesn't have this. We cited an example of Brigitte Macron, who's the wife of the current president of France, saying like, there's il and elle, and that's enough. And that's the way the French language works. I cite some people in Italy saying the same thing. And we hear this time and time again. And if we flip that script and we say, well, language doesn't exist, like it doesn't have things, it doesn't do things, people do things. People do things through languaging in lots of ways, by speaking, by typing, by reading, by thinking, because we think in language, we ideate in language, we imagine in language, and so forth and so on. That allows us to step into this and say like, well, of course there are these boxes, but the boxes are ephemeral. Like the boxes are not doing what you think they are, and they can move. We have so many boxes in life. We have people who are gray-haired and red-haired and bald and so forth. And those are boxes, but give them the weight that we give other things. Those maybe some people do. I say that out loud. But obviously that's not a shared construct. And I think that's a really helpful way of us stepping into this, because we're also in conversation. A book is a conversation. And we're in conversation with an audience that is deeply engaged in this type of work, both as activists and as intellectuals. But we're also engaged in people who are just sort of exploring and wondering, or are being forced to read this because it's course material or what have you, or they heard this podcast and now they're fascinated with it. And I think it's really important that we kind of start there and say, like, this is what we think language is. And that sets the basis for how we then do a lot. Chris, would you say, is it flipping scripts or is it just sort of like throwing them up in the air and saying
shaking
like,
the table?
I think some of them were flipping, some of them were unscripting.
Some of them were just, in other classes and other work I do, I would say they're effing the script. I might actually articulate that out loud in other podcasts.
And in our conclusion, we're calling BS on the script in so many words.
You can swear fully on this podcast.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
love that you swore in your paper, Eric.
Our entire conclusion is full of swearing with a purpose.
And also, just sidebar, shout out to our editors. They never batted an eyelash on that. We had a couple of reviewers that did, but even our editors stood by us, as we said after reviews came in. And we thought we had a moment of reflection. I think Chris and I did. I'm probably the one that said, like, well, fuck this. Of course we're going to keep this in there. This is important. This is important because we're also speaking to a linguistic community, a community of scholars. By that, I mean. And I think it's really important that we shake things up.
And I think our conclusion and the vulgarity through which we write our conclusion is very much serving a purpose. And that's what we came to, is that language does something.
I think we even said that in there somewhere.
You perhaps are angry about the language that we've chosen. Yes, we absolutely wrote that.
That was the easiest thing we wrote. I think I was still on sabbatical in Trieste, and we're doing this back and forth by a box. And I'm fairly certain, because I am very fast and loose with vulgarity. I teach a class on taboo language. I have a book that just came out on very, very bad language practices, or that which is judged to be very bad, I should say, the way I try to have my students articulate it. So I think I said, like, oh, fuck this. Of course, like, we're like bullshit, like just bullshit on all of this. Bullshit on like the over hyper saliency of gender, but also on people dismissing gender, and bullshit on the fact, like, of course, language can't harm you, but people use language to harm people all the time.
Yeah, all of the time.
And it feels like language is harming you. And bullshit on people dismissing that. Bullshit on these people who will say things like, I've never had to use yed. I've never had to use, in Italian, there's a debate right now around the use of schwa as a non-traditionally gendered morpheme marker. They'll say, like, how dare you make me do this? And I think, well, how dare I make you use my name? How dare I make you pronounce my name in a certain way? You would laugh at me if anyone said, like, oh, no, I want to refer to you as Amy or some other name. Like, of course. You might think my name is silly. You might think it's pretentious that I have two given names, but you call me by these names. So bullshit on that. Honestly, I think we need to do more of that, and we hide behind a certain intellectualism. But these are real people. At the end of the day, it's people who matter. People in communities that matter, and there are people in communities that are not being allowed to matter enough.
I like that a lot.
I like that too.
So I have a question, because I hadn't seen this before. What is a critical linguist?
Can I answer the way I really want to answer, with vulgarity?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
I think critical theories are fucking with that which other people, particularly people with more entrenched access to power and authority, it is fucking with that which they would rather have unfucked with. That is the best way I can articulate this. I've also, in one of my grad seminars, and my students were so delightful, they even made this lovely poster for me, because I have this slogan where I'm like, we fuck with the patriarchy because the patriarchy isn't going to fuck itself. And I think that's what a critical linguist does. A critical linguist, much like anyone working in any critical theory, identifies a problem and defines that problem, and then steps into it and tries to peel back the layers and look at the dynamic. I tend to think in Gramscian terms. So I think, hegemony and power structures and dynamics of coercion and consent and so forth and so on, and how this becomes naturalized such that people don't even see it, let alone question it. So I think critical linguist steps into that dynamic and basically fucks with it. And basically says, you know what? No one is asking a question about this. Everyone thinks this is inevitable, or that is just the way the gods or evolution or science or something has made this situation, and says, we're going to ask questions about it. It doesn't mean we full on dismiss everything, but we bring into the light of questioning, into interrogation, that which is usually taken aside and said, like, no, there are no questions to ask about this. That's what a critical linguist does. Of course, looking at languaging and looking at all sorts of aspects of it, just as a critical theorist in, say, economics or sociology or anthropology or any of these other disciplines, and literary studies and art would do the same thing. There aren't that many folks using that term, though there is critical discourse studies. So that, is sort of a corner of it that is kind of as some folks are using this term, is sort of like the place where it's taken the most root. I think queer linguistics, feminist linguistics are spaces where you see people who define themselves critical thinkers. They just don't always say they're critical linguists, but that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you asked that, Carrie, too, because I didn't even realize, Eric, that this is something you and I have in common. I may be known for being slightly on the verbose side. Eric, you can very politely or less politely agree that much of Eric's job was going, yeah, okay, you had one thought in those 3 pages, so maybe we can make that into 1 paragraph. Every time I went, Eric, you're right. I don't tend to be condensed, but when people get asking me for bios, I write half a page and then I go, no one wants to read that much about me. How can I make it 2 sentences? And critical is always the word gets cut off there. But I didn't realize that you and I both sort of think through that lens, because I would describe myself regularly as a critical applied linguist. That's often how I describe myself to my grad students when they're like, what are you? I'm like, let's say I'm a critical applied linguist or a critical applied sociolinguist, something like that. And for me, I love that you were talking about the questioning, because if you had asked me the same thing, I'd probably, in much more polite words, because I still feel the pull. I'm waiting to advance in my career and feel no pull and be the same on and off recording.
Where I have gotten to the point where Chris knows this, I'm like, oh, I don't fucking care.
I wrote that chapter with you and also experienced it as the greatest therapy writing of my life. But for me, I always talk about it in terms of the pedagogical approach to restive problematizing. Is constantly sitting back and asking, what is the status quo? Why is it this way? Who benefits? Who's marginal? What alternatives exist? How is this happening through language, right? Like all of these critical questions that I pass around to my students. And I'm like, here, tuck this non-bookmark bookmark in your book, because these are the questions I'm going to be asking you every single day. Soon you'll rattle them off like I do.
One of the great joys of my professional career is teaching a class that is for non-humanities, non-language, non-linguistic students. It's the class on bad language that I teach usually about once a year. They're very often STEM students. UC Davis is a very STEM-focused campus. And one of the things I lead with them is a couple things. One, I tell them, like, you're biased and you'll always be biased. Very well-intentioned, right? And they believe they can perhaps achieve the nirvana of being unbiased someday. And we talk about how to hold that intention. And then I also tell them, like, your answers are good and they come up, but really this is the work of asking questions. Like being a critical thinker, being a critical linguist, being a critical scholar is really just, as Chris is saying, it is just fearlessly asking the next question when someone gives you an answer and doing it better. Ideally, theory serves for is to help us better ask questions rather than to provide answers. And that is something that I probably would make some of my colleagues' heads explode. But I really do think that's the work that we do. There are all sorts of questions that Chris and I have not asked in this book that we haven't even imagined, both individually and together as we work. And we just had a conversation the other day. And every time we do this and we go down these rabbit holes of talking, I think, gosh, I left this conversation with like 3 or 8 or something more questions than I had had. And some of them are practical and some of them are so large, those pleasurable questions that you'll never not wrestle with. But I think that's the heart of it for me, is the fearless asking of questions and also calling, to go back to our conclusion, that is not a conclusion, how we tried to articulate that, is calling bullshit on the sort of finality of answers that are being offered by many people. Some of that has to be on our own discipline, our own fields, as well as we've talked about, Chris and I really wrestled with this, the sort of hyper salience of gender to the expense of other things as well. We see that with all sorts of questions in the language cultures that we participate in right now. It's my politically correct way of saying it.
And I think what we did too, Eric, is have a moment where we went, how normative and how, to use one of my favorite words, how cislingual of us to think about this as ever being something that we could write in its totality. If trans thinking gives us anything, it's the reminder that there's always infinite possibility. Things can never be anything more than pinned down, right? And taking those ideas from queer linguistics and queer theory and thinking about them differently, just sort of not rushing into something that we don't have answers to, and not looking to map out and write this forever existing grammar and rules for how this works, because the whole point of a lot of these lingual cultural communities is there doesn't have to be one way. There is not one way. Here are some ways. And pushing back against people who don't have a relationship to these communities, wanting to come in and observe and say, I've got it figured out. If only you do this, it's perfect. Or to borrow from Lal Zimin's piece, my favorite title, I think, The Cis Gays,
Yeah, that's
from
good.
2021, where he wrote about something that Eric and I have also been long wrestling with, which is people making comments about how XYZ way of doing it isn't creative enough. How binarist of you to put il and elle together in French and get yel. Well, guess what? We have to think about what that does in context and why that does work for some people. Maybe conceptually it works for some people. Conceptually, it doesn't work for other people. That's the whole point, right? And then there's a bit of safety to something that you can mishear. And so we have to think about, how does that play out if someone can choose to ignore that I've languaged in a perhaps unexpected or non-cisnormative way? Well, if someone violently responds to what they think they heard, oh, no, I just said il or elle or whatever, right? There's a backpedal and there's the ability to sort of play through that interaction without potentially bringing harms to oneself. So I think there are just factors that get missed when we try to pin down one solution. And it's going to be Kirby Conrad Day again. Kirby, if you're listening to this podcast someday, my brain loves playing little sound bites from you. Kirby talk about there's no shortage of pronouns at the pronoun store. And I think that's something that we have to remember on even a broader scale than pronouns when we have languages that are doing gender in more ways. There's no shortage of ways of languaging at the language store, right? You can do all of these things and people have multiple pronouns and people have multiple approaches. And shout out this time to Artemis Lopez. We do direct and indirect ways of trying to communicate our worlds. And sometimes I'm going to use very specific, clearly non-binary ways of doing language and do these direct non-binary things. And other times I'm going to make indirect choices, whether that's because I need to use pseudonormative ways to navigate the power structures and what people believe about my language and et cetera, or because maybe that's just what works best for me in that specific setting, in that specific moment, in my specific selfhood, etc. And please cut me off now because I'm going down the rabbit hole and it'll go for a long, long ways.
You're really making it clear for me that we have like a finality problem in linguistics where people want a final answer.
It's not linguistics. It's people.
No, it's not. Linguists are people too. I mean, sometimes we wonder.
Wait, what?
Breaking news.
Breaking news, yeah. We're still humans. I think it is a finality problem. And I think it's that, to come back to the analogy or the metaphoric way of understanding, like putting things in boxes. And this just happens to be about one. I refer to this as a really highly ranking discourse, the discourse of gender identity, that which gets conflated with biological sexual identity. And a lot of people, and we're aware of that, even if we push against it. This is sort of like using that as a cover term. We're still part of this human condition where we want to have the boxes stable. And then we also have institutional and sort of disciplinary practice pressures upon us. Chris and I know this very well. We have to be productive at a certain rate. And editors don't like journal articles and will not often publish them if they're just a series of questions that have tentative sort of allusions, but not definitive answers. If you think about the way we structure our work, it's introduction, description, interpretation, argumentation, and conclusion. There's not a lot of space to sort of ambient questioning being the true or truthy, I suppose, way we're doing things and what we're aiming for. And I know look, it's a book. It has a beginning and an end. It has a first page and a last page. We can't fully push against it, but I hope we model a different way of maybe being in our intellectual, our disciplinary, our professional worlds, as well as attending to how other people are doing worlds that are far more consequential than, academia and far more consequential than linguistic publishing.
I think that's part of what we call BS on too, is BS on our own self-importance. Eric and I absolutely included in that.
Absolutely.
BS on all what we bring just based on where we have been growing up and the roles that we've taken up.
So I know this is kind of late in the conversation, but what is gender?
Chris?
It's complicated, right?
It's complicated.
You do a much better job of answering this succinctly. I'll end up on the moon and back before we get there. Take it away, Chris.
For us in our book, we think about gender in two ways. The first of those being what most people think about when they think about gender, right? The social aspect of these social, relational practices, roles, identities, positionalities, this messiness that we're doing, right? So, shocker, we told you that language isn't a thing. Well, I'm also going to tell you that gender isn't a thing. And they both are things, but they're also not things, right? If we're really talking about what it is, it's this constant doing. And not a doing without memory, but I sort of put out there my own practice, my own identities, and I try to position myself either as like or different from other people in the ways that they're doing gender. And so it's this like messy nebulous of absolutely infinite categories that we then go, yeah, that and that and that. For people who are listening to the audio, I'm making a scrunched down box with my hands, trying to just shove all of these particular positionalities and roles and ways of being in the world into this box and going, yep, that looks like a gender. And I set up these various boxes, and then other people go, hey, I sort of fit in that box. Or in the case of people in our book, they go, yeah, those boxes are nonsense. Let's keep reshuffling. You said I'd do this succinctly, Eric. You lied.
You're doing it better than I would. But I like gender, like just like language is a doing. We're languaging, we're gendering. It's really nice that we have the gerundive form in English that we can do that. It's hard to sort of transliterate into other language cultural practices, but it's a doing.
And then it's this social relational doing that we, Kirby Conrad, filter into legible categories that are infinite, but often we break down regularly into three: men, women, non-binary people. Maybe we start to break things out more and we start thinking about, well, there are also agender people who are somewhere in this. We make all these boxes, right? And then we get into sort of gender identity, which is then how are we positioning ourselves vis-a-vis the boxes that we're aware of? And then all of that gets communicated in gender expression, which comes down to these embodiments, enlanguagements, all the social practices that allow us to sort of put gender out there. And so you're unsurprised, perhaps, that we say none of this exists before us or without us. There is no a priori gender. We've made this stuff up. We sometimes connect it to particular embodiments or particular behaviors or particular positions. But all of that is constantly up for grabs and constantly up for redoing. And then the second way that we really think about gender, what people talk about is grammatical gender or linguistic gender, right? These noun classes, or however we might mark something that is kind of related to social gender sometimes in our minds.
But also very often not, and in a complex tension, because it's sort of like a cover story in a lot of ways, because we are a large brain species and we go through our lives, and of course we've been talking about asking questions, but we can't constantly be asking these questions at every moment with every new stimulus, with every new experience, with every new moment, even if they're just with ourselves. We language to ourselves, we gender to ourselves, even when we're alone in a room. And it takes on lots of forms. But this is where it becomes really complicated and messy, because language can be a trap as much as a liberation, or languaging can trap us as much as it can liberate us. Shout out to the poets, who are probably the ones who realize this on a more elegant and daily basis than those of us who are mere mortal linguists. But it's fascinating too, is like gender is also something that the way we do gender to ourselves and to others, this is a lot like all objects. When we observe what we think as objects and we make statements about them, whether it's about quote unquote gender or about anything in the world, actually saying much more about ourselves than we are about that object. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize about gender. When people are talking about gender, whether it's Chris and I or our contributors or anyone out there, different sides of the sociocultural, anthropological, political spectrum, they're really saying things about themselves. When it came to gender, we tried to say, like, of course we can't, we're trapped in this, right? Like that's humanity. But we want to both say something about our positionality and our disciplinary positionality, but also allow that to just be us. Like this is only Chris and Eric, or there's Chris's chapter, just Chris, or mine is just mine, and so forth and so on. And not say that that's the way it has to be. Sort of like thinking about gender is a truth, quote unquote, like with a small t, but just because it's your truth doesn't mean it's everyone's truth. And none of us have access to the capital T truth. Am I doing it justice, Chris?
I think there's something to that.
My philosophical underpinnings come out.
Yeah. I think the way that I would wrap my brain around it is just this idea that gender is limitless and expansive. And I think Eric would join me in arguing that it should be optional.
But it doesn't feel like it.
It doesn't. And it's made not optional by all means. But I think like in this idyllic world, who cares about gender? Except if you care about gender, care about it as much as you want. And so that's sort of this tension, I think, in the way that we have to think if we're thinking with trans knowledges and all of these ways of doing gender and doing gender modality and doing language that say it's limitless. And there are things that we have in common and there are things that we can talk about. And if you don't want to do gender unto yourself, awesome, don't. If you do, awesome, do. I think about Colby Gordon, who regularly is on the internet. It's like, you want to do some hormones? Just do some. And that's kind of how I feel about gender. Want to do some gender? Go for it. Don't want to do some gender? Don't. That's the world that we'd like to prefigure in many ways, is more space to do or not do, more space to participate or not participate, more space to language however it works for you. Because, geez, what are we really doing when we're doing language and when we're doing gender? We're trying to relate to one another and we're trying to share our world with someone else, whether it's to describe it or invite someone into it or what have you. It's about these social connections and it's about relating to one another. Because for me, a lot of this doesn't really matter unless I'm engaged in social relationships. Perhaps for other people it does. Perhaps when they are alone, disconnected from the world, it still matters.
Chris brought up something in its theme that I know I wrestle with a lot, that we talk about in the book, that is kind of central to my chapter that I wrote on Italian. And that really is participation. And so if gendering, I kind of want to insist on that, is like the sort of verbalness of it, the doingness of it. Gendering to oneself, to others, conceptually, ideologically, and so like there are all sorts of ways of doing, right? Gendering allows for greater participation. Great. If gendering forecloses participation, ooh, this is where I think we need to throw a flag on the pitch. And it also reverts back to my thinking about, like, it really is not about gendering. It's about the person doing the gendering. That's the crux of the issue. Like, we're really trying to, I think Chris and I think all sort of like feminist linguistics, trans, queer linguistics, different critical approaches, we're trying to radically recenter and expand the space for the human. Our disciplinarity tends to push humans out to the side, including some very famous linguists who are entirely dismissive of the human, except in their idealized, cis, white, middle-class, straight Anglophone space. We all had to swallow a lot of that to get through our graduate programs and so forth. And so that'll be the end of my critique of that. But I think this act of rethinking gendering and rethinking languaging is an act of re-participating the human and also recentering the human, because really at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's about humans. It's about humans and their relation with other humans and also their relation with themselves. And I think gendering, whether we all, like the four of us in this virtual room, we're doing it in different ways, potentially probably something 4 to the 4th power, right? Different ways at different times. But it is still something that, at least in our anthropological settings, is really, really important. It's highly salient aspect of our being, of our doing, of our existing, of our thinking, our understanding. And if we can shake that up, if we can give people new questions about gendering, about what it means to gender, the self, the others, the society, then I think, I feel like we can be happy with what we're doing. Again, like the humans have to be the center of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm agreed in that. Too often, I'll say linguists this time because I mean linguists, not just people. We remove the language from the person too often.
Yeah, in this case, yes, linguists is more relevant. I just don't want to let linguists off the hook.
Absolutely.
I feel like the latter half of my career has been about challenging that. And I know Chris has been a great inspiration for this, our conversations, not just about the book, about other things. But I feel like we are kind of swimming against not only just habits of languaging about language, right? We just say like, oh, French has this and Italian does that and German and so forth. Like, you can't do this in German or something, all these like habits that we have. But we're also pushing against really strong disciplinary forces. I remember being a graduate student and sitting in, I think it was a government and binding syntax class, which is the class that convinced me that I would never be a syntactician, and hearing about this theory that supposedly accounted for syntax, so, the way people organize clauses, phrases, sentences, utterances, and so forth, and thinking, this doesn't even work for the English being used around me, let alone the other languages I use on a daily basis. What the fuck is the point? Turning to colleagues of mine, fellow graduate students who came from different linguocultural backgrounds, as well as ones that they shared with me, French speakers, Dutch speakers, and so forth, and saying like, can you make this work without massive amounts of tricks? I think gender is something like that too. We over-theorize, or we give theory the wrong type of power when we go into this. Like, ideally, theory helps us ask better questions with perhaps more acumen, or gives us maybe some common ground to stand on with the people that we're talking to and speaking with and asking questions of and so forth. But theory isn't true.
No.
But we forget that. And we are told to forget that time and time again in our fields. I've only ever been a linguist, so I don't want to answer for other disciplines, but I feel like this really needs to be a question that linguists have to start wrestling with. Otherwise, they are forgetting we are fundamentally talking about ourselves. We're not saying anything about the objects that we purport to be studying. I'm not sure we can at a vast theoretical level. Anyway. Okay, Chris, now it's your turn to cut me off.
It doesn't exist without us or before us. I like listening to talk about what we're pushing back to in our disciplines. And I think maybe for as much as the thing that you are productively stuck on as participation, I think that maybe thinking about my role as a language educator really explains the piece that I think is productive, but that I'm absolutely stuck on for sure, is being expansive, making our disciplines bigger, making our worlds bigger. And I think we think through two different frames that often lead us to the same point, perhaps after a bit of back and forth productive arguing. But for me, I think there's a tendency to want to pin down and get this final answer, because on Monday, I'm walking into class and I'm teaching this. So if there are limitless pronouns or limitless forms for this, what am I supposed to teach on Monday? And what am I supposed to say when someone asks me, what are all the options? So I think for me, I'm thinking about having this conversation with students, building on people who are Anne Charity Hudley and Mary Buckholtz, and who else was on that paper?
Kristen Mallinson.
Yeah, talking about like, why is your linguistics so small? Why does it have to be harmful? And so I think thinking with people having those conversations, that's what I'm asking of language teachers. Yes, you have to teach something concrete, but there's nothing stopping you from teaching something a little bit bigger and teaching that I'm teaching you a small number of forms. I'm probably teaching you traditional, very binarist forms. And then maybe I'm doing better and I'm adding on a couple of other forms that are representative of the kinds of other pronouns, forms, structures that may exist. But then I'm really trying to teach you that I could never possibly teach you everything, that the book could never possibly be exhaustive, and that it's stuck in time. It's stuck in the linguistic worlds of the people who wrote it and of the people who crammed it into the boxes that they thought they could sell at mass market. And so for me, I think that's where I really get stuck on. It has to be bigger. And we have to teach this underlying thinking. And then as linguists who are doing studies and coming here to say that this is how language is functioning in this particular context at this particular time, all of us have to really get messier. I don't know exactly how to put it, but just accept that there is not finality. Let's all be a little more trans in the way we think.
I love that.
I always think like, yeah, let's all be queer. And I think some of this, Chris and I have talked about it several times in our roles, instructors and faculty members, mentors and so forth. But I think one of the things we can also do is model the expansiveness, model the unanchoredness at times, model the tentativeness of even some of the things we're asserting and we're trying to describe. And I think that's really important for us to do. I feel like sometimes, not just in our publication and our research work, but just in our pedagogical work, that we forget that we're in this really privileged and powerful gatekeeping role. We need to keep that in mind. And so we tried to do this throughout the book. We sort of tried to model how we want to see other folks maybe attend to language and attend to gendering and languaging and so forth. I hope that comes out in other aspects. Of course, I fail all the time in this, so I don't want to pretend I'm perfect by any stretch. But I think that's the work, right? That's the work of radically recentering humans too, because we are also human. And so we can do that to and through and among ourselves, as well as just in these really delightful, wonderful places that we have that we've been afforded, which is the classroom, or our position within it. It really is just a wonderful thing to be in, right? And so even, of course, we have to make these goals. And I think about this constantly, even when it comes to like teaching them to write in academic English, right? Which is really just, Bourdieu would say, I think it's a form of social violence and symbolic violence.
Absolutely.
And yet, I mean, I also recognize that for a lot of these students, being able to do that, being able to play that game in that way affords less precarity, affords more participation, affords potential to do power. And that's really important. And maybe we'll allow other voices in, but it's attention, right? I've never found the perfect way to do it. So I just sort of lead with, well, this is kind of bullshit, but I mean, this is the bullshit that is being required of you. So we can do it while knowing it's what it is. We can do the same thing with gender. Like you go to a French speaking environment and it's kind of bullshit, right? Like most people are very cis heteronormative in their ways of understanding languaging and in a system that has emerged from the doing, that has une and un class and so forth. And you need to know that. And sometimes you're going to need to just fake it and play to that. But you can also know that this is just a game, metaphorically speaking. It is not the way God created, or the gods, or evolution, or whatever mythology that you hold to about that. This is not something that is prioristic. This is something that's done and redone and iterated and reiterated. And we're all just trying to figure out a way to do that in the best, most humanistic way possible.
It's that tension between doing symbolic violence and teaching symbolic competence, in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to teach that there are more possibilities, and we also have to teach what the power game is and what are some options for navigating it and pushing back against it if you so choose. And heads up, you'll probably encounter someone who says, that's not French.
Yeah.
A lot of times people will say, well, that doesn't exist in French. Well, probably not for you. If that's your perspective on it from jump, I'm guessing that you're not involved in the linguocultural communities where this is happening. But your experiences are not the limits of reality. Your world is not the only world. And so I think teaching students also how to language about that and just honor their agency to decide when and where and whether to push back against those things is what we're into when we're there.
Just like in our intellectual work, our role is researcher, scholar, and we're pulling back these layers and trying to denaturalize and re-question that which has been naturalized and rendered unquestionable. We can model this for students too, and we can do it in a way that says okay, doing language is doing power as well. And so this is going to be happening, and we can sort of lead with that. What I find really enriching about it is that they will run with this farther than I intended most of the time. The students are far smarter than I am. They're far more creative.
Mm-hmm. I'm
old and gray-haired and mortgage and all these other things that render my life rather dull. But they're kind of on the cutting edge of this. And that's what they should be. That's what 18 to 24, 25 should be. It's this wonderful age of questioning and living and upturning and undoing and unraveling that I think can be really beautiful. And if we can give them some skills for that, even as we give them the skills to play within this symbolic system, that will allow them to fuck with the patriarchy or the patriarchies. I'm not super convinced about that term, but it does roll off the tongue nicely, right? I think we're doing our job. At least I hope we're doing our job. And hope is sort of like really all we have about this, right? Because we can't know. We can't know the future. Can't know what's going on in other people's minds.
Barely know what's going on in my own.
No kidding. Definitely.
This has been a really great conversation. Are there any last words you want to leave our listeners with?
I would love to hear from people that want to be part of our next volume and the next set of conversations that we're trying to hold space for. So reach out to Chris or myself. I'm sure there's a way to get our emails and stuff, attached somewhere. But also you can just Google us.
You're Googleable.
The internet.
The interwebs are all out there, right?
And I think maybe we should close out much like we left off on the book and invite every person to think constantly and reiteratively about how we do language, how we do gender, and think about our doings and how our doings can make our imaginary worlds bigger, more equitable, more connected, and more just for all of us.
I love that.
That's beautiful.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much for having this amazing conversation with us.
And we always leave our listeners with one final message.
Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Co-signed.
Yeah. Put my name right on that one as well.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at VocalFriesPod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.